Welcome. In this video, we will look at errors, warnings, and logs. We'll begin by looking at some validation errors, then move on to configure errors, backup errors, restore warnings, and finally wrap up with log locations. We begin by logging into our installation server. We'll enter in a username, a password, accept the terms and conditions, and then click on the login button. From here, I'll select an existing deployment, one entitled blank deployment. That is the default deployment that you get once you create a new deployment. And I've also created the workflow server card as well as the global search card, but left them blank. And the purpose here is I want to be able to validate when all values are empty. So I'll go ahead and click on validate, and immediately we get a response back with a whole bunch of errors on each of the different cards because we've left a whole bunch of fields blank that should have value. So let's go through them quickly. So the database server card that you see on the left, I'll quickly point out as well, each card lists out the number of errors that we've found on each of the different cards. So database server has 5, deployment manager has 9, application server has 3, and so forth. Now, looking in the database server card, if we select the host name field, you'll see the pop-up, the error tooltip appear. It says property host in the DB section is empty. And likewise, if you scroll back down, you'll see 4 more. All of these, of course, add up to the 5 that you see on the card, and they all more or less say the same thing. So property DBA username in the database section is empty. Let's take a look now at the deployment manager card. So this one has a 9. Once again, the host name, you select the field, you see the tooltip. Same thing for username and password, those are just empty. However, we're seeing a different one here for the agent directory. So this one is saying property agent directory has the wrong path format for OS Linux. Now, the reason we're seeing this is because the operating system is set to Linux on this card, but we've provided it a Windows path. So the pre-validation will pick up on that as well. Conversely, if you had the operating system set to Windows and you had a Linux or AIX path, then it would complain about that as well. And so forth and so forth. So for the rest of these. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you with the validation errors. This is one set of validation errors. So now let me switch over to another deployment. This one's called Cognos Down. And what you see here is once I switch to this deployment, one thing to note with errors, logs, and warnings, things like that, is that as you switch deployments, those errors and warnings will actually stick. So I haven't done anything since I switched to this deployment, yet you'll see the report card actually has 2 errors already associated to it. So the first thing to do is select the card that has errors. Then in the card detail area, scroll up and down to see if we've highlighted any fields that are problematic. In this case, we're not seeing any. So I can go ahead and click on this this link at the top. It says error, please view log here. Okay, and once we've selected the actual link, you'll have the option to save it or open it depending on your browser preference. I'll go ahead and click on save. That downloads the validation.pdf. If I then open it up, what we're going to see here is a page for each of the different server cards that we have in our deployment. The top one is the database card. So as you'll go through, you'll see line items, pass, warning, or fail for each of the different validations that we're doing. So you'll see remote database validation, successfully accessed OP as user. You'll see some warnings. The next page is for the deployment manager. So one warning here you might see is it checks for the CPU validation. So this particular system has 2 CPUs, but 4 CPUs are recommended, and it's also giving us a warning about the disk space as well. So the errors that we saw were on the reporting server. So we're going to keep scrolling down until we find them. However, here's another page for the application server, and once again, it's complaining about the CPUs and disk space validation because both of those are hosted on the same machine, so that makes sense there. So now let's see if we find our errors. We're now on the report server card. This is where we expect to find the errors. And sure enough, we see that we have two errors. So the first is failing because Cognos is not running, and the second one is failing because it can't connect to the Cognos dispatcher URL, which of course makes sense because Cognos isn't running. So that gives you an idea of two separate types of validation issues. One where we have issues with the input fields, and then the second where we actually have validation issues with the deployment overall. So now let's take a look at some errors that you might run into when you try to do a configure. So I'll go ahead and switch over to this configure failed deployment. Once again, we switched over to the deployment. All the errors, warnings, and logs that were there previously will be there as well as you're switching over. So I've previously clicked on configure, it failed, and it shows us some errors here. You'll see that the configure button is still enabled because it'll allow you to carry on from where you left off. And one thing I want to point out here as well is you have this option when you're setting up your deployment to roll back on failure. And what that means is, let's say this deployment manager, the one that failed, had 10 steps, and you had this set to true, and it failed on step 9. Roll back on failure, if it's set to true and it encounters an issue, it'll roll back step 9 because that was the step that failed. However, it's set to false. Once this configure fails, it won't try to roll anything back. The state of the application at the time that failed will continue to be the state of the application afterwards. So just be aware of that, and it all depends on how you want to have it set up as you're doing your install, and whether or not you want to try to debug it yourself if it fails, things like that. However, let's get back to the errors here. So configure failed. The first thing I want to do is take a look at the card. So we have one error on the dmanager card. I'll quickly inspect the card detail section to see if we pointed out any errors for the input fields. There's nothing there. And one thing we actually see here is there's now this ability to download a specific log for a specific card. So let me go ahead and actually click on this. Once again, I'll be prompted to either save or open depending on the browser's preference. I'll go ahead and I'll click on save. And let's open it real quick. I'll open it with Notepad++. Okay, and scroll all the way down to the bottom. And I see something here that says error generated OpenPages dmanager port def. Let's scroll up a little bit just to see if we find anything a little bit more useful. Oh, this looks like something on line 1135. It says conflict detected on port 8879. Likely causes an instance of the server dmanager is already running, or some other process is using port 8879. So what happened here was that we tried to do a configure. Some other process had port 8879, and the dmanager was unable to start, so that's why it failed. So from here, users can fix that issue of that port binding, and then carry on by just clicking on configure, and then it'll pick up exactly where it left off. So that's for configure. Now let's take a look at something we might see for doing a backup. So I'll switch over to that deployment. Okay, and once again we switch to deployment. Any errors that were there previously we'll see on the cards. So in this case, we have one error on the application server card, one on the report server card. Search server looks okay. If I wanted to download individual logs, I can do so by just clicking on the download log for each of the different cards like we just saw. But in this case, I want to see the backup, the overall backup fail. So I'm going to click on here. This will prompt me to download the backup log. Go ahead and do so. And this is going to look a little bit different than the other logs that we've seen. Just going to open this up in Notepad++. So this is more of a simplistic view of a log here. So we have an entry for each of the different cards. So app server, it failed paths. It says failed to copy, and it provides a path to this other location, and a similar error for this for report server, failed to copy, and it lists out the path. So this is where it's trying to copy from, and the second part is where it's trying to copy to. And so the reason that both of these fail is because of path issues. So the first one had a bad path, so did the second one. The third one, which is search, had a valid path, and that was able to succeed. So that gives you an idea of some of the errors, some of the logs for the backup and some things you might see. Now let's move over to the restore. So I have a deployment called restore failed that's already been set up, so we can take a look at some issues you might see with restore. So here we'll see, if I scroll down, excuse me, you'll see 3 cards that have warnings on them: search, report, and application. And as you recall, when you do backup or restore, you're really only doing it to either an application server, reporting server, or search server. So it makes sense that we're only seeing something for these 3 cards here. Once again, if you wanted to download the individual log for each of these cards, you can do so by clicking on the download log. In this case, I'll just click on the very top. I'll get restore log. I'll save it or open it depending on my browser's preference. I'll open this up in Notepad++. Okay, and now let's take a closer look. So we saw 3 warnings for those cards, and each one of them appear to have more or less the same message here. So unable to copy lists out a path to another location without overwriting. Now the reason for this is because as part of the backup, if you recall from the backup and restore video, there was a toggle that says overwrite files during restore. And in this particular case, all 3 of the cards had it set to false, meaning if it encountered a previously existing file, it wouldn't overwrite it. So when the restore happened, it didn't fail the restore. We just provide warnings to let the user know that those files weren't updated properly. So in order to fix that, if you did want to overwrite it, you would simply just go back, do a backup, make sure that the overwrite existing files is set to true, and then once you get back to the restore, you would simply click on the restore top right, and then it'll go ahead and it'll overwrite those files, and those warnings will no longer appear. So the last thing I wanted to show you is the location of logs. So to do that, I'm going to open up WinSCP. I'm going to navigate to the installation server. And so I'm at the installation server in the directory where the installation server has been set up. I'll log into source, deployment. This directory contains all the deployments that the installation server is aware of, and I'll just navigate into one of the deployments that I want to take a look at. In this case, restore failed, since that was the last deployment we just looked at. So in here, you'll see there's a backup record log. If I go to edit it, you'll see it's the same exact log that we just saw for backup. The restore one is here. So here we have the restore record log. Once again, we have the different warnings because it wasn't able to overwrite a previously existing file because we had the toggle set to false. So we see that we have the restore log here as well as the backup. If you want to take a look at the validation PDF, it's located again underneath deployment, name of the deployment, and the validation folder. You'll have the validation PDF here. Otherwise, if you want to take a look at the individual logs, you can go into logs, and then you can also go into nodes, and then there's a directory for each of the different cards in your deployment. You can simply just drill into each one, and then anything that has a .log, if it's of a .log type text file, then that's a log for a particular action. So we have backup log, we have config log, install log, restart log, and uninstall log. So those are different logs that you can take a look at for a particular server card. And then if we move up to the base of the logs directory, you'll have this installer.log, which keeps track of all of the logging information that the installation server is keeping track of for this particular deployment. So that concludes this video. In this video, we have looked at errors, warnings, and logs. We hope you found this video helpful, and we invite you to follow along with some of our other videos.